8 people have been killed and 4 injured as thousands have taken the streets in recent demonstrations in Kenya. The government's banned TV and live radio coverage of protests, but the High Court recently overturned that decision. One protester said they are protesting for the future of their kids. She feels like as a country, we're not going in the right direction, especially in education with everything happening. There's a fence around the Parliament building was covered in notes from grieving families and defiant youth, a reminder of the last years of unrest. So, Dale, what's the finance bill?
So in 2024, there was an austerity-laced finance bill that was put forward by the Prime Minister Ruto. And I think essentially it was something that was, basically like handed down from the IMF. The IMF essentially puts these countries in this position where it's like, you're going to take out these loans that are impossible to actually like fulfill. And then once you default on your loan, we're going to force you to take on these austerity measures, or else you're not going to get like a halfway decent like trade agreement, decent for the ruling class, not decent for everyday working people, obviously. And so like, I do think like some of these protests are like kind of building off of in some way the protests that popped off around this last year, I think there was some really, some massive protests that were happening. And it's important to recognize that like one of the, two of the big groups that were really trying to unite with the youth in this particular situation were the Communist Party of Kenya Marxist, and it was also the National Trade Unions Organization, because they recognized that like the prime minister signing this finance bill would essentially put everybody in poverty. And it's one of these situations where it's like imperial powers are trying to take control over the situation. And the thing that like prevented that from, really getting just rammed through was people coming up and united and just causing a ruckus,
Yeah. And so let's see here. Some things going on in some of these finance bills. So it's a series of tax reforms aimed to increase the tax to GDP ratio from 13.5% to 20%. So Kenya has the potential of a 25% tax to GDP ratio. So basically just raising the taxes, right? So basically the IMF is demanding that the government tax the people more so that they can keep up with their debt obligations. So this finance bill is supposed to allow Kenya to have its debt restructured by the IMF, right? So we'll continue to loan you money if you continue to tax the people at higher and higher levels. Awesome. So the figures I gave you at the beginning were from a demonstration on June 9th in Nairobi. But on June 25th, 1,000 more protesters gathered to commemorate the fight for the Kenyan finance bill that led to over 15 people killed and 400 more were injured. So far, 2 police officers have been arraigned over the blatant shooting of street protesters. One particular instance, the Kenyan blogger Albert Ojwang was arrested on June 6th for the false publication that criticized the deputy inspector of the general police. Ojwang was then killed in police custody due to a sustained head injury, which his death has been a lot of the impetus of these finance bills protests. Wow. Well, I just think like you see like the there's a lot of different connections. There's a lot of different things going on in this situation, right? You have like the larger issue of austerity, right? The government is squeezing the people. They're squeezing the people at the behest of these international financial institutions. And in order to do that, they have to be incredibly brutal, right? They have to be brutal toward the people, right? Because this is their livelihood. Like imagine going from, up to 13.5% to at some point 25% tax to GDP. So gross direct domestic product, so 25% of everything you produce being taxed, right? Can you imagine that? Like what that actually means for the average person if that were to be enforced? Like if that happened to us in this society, like most people would roll over and fucking die, right? But that's just something
or they would actually take to the streets
or
and
they
try
would
and
actually
do
take
something.
the streets and do something, obviously, hopefully, right? But this is a very serious thing, and it's being forced upon these masses of people in Kenya, without their consent, right? And then when they try to do something about it, the government fucking shoots and kills them, arrests them, beats them so bad they die, right? And so that's ultimately something that, like, they're upset and angry about, as well as the violation of their basic civil rights. They do that, right? The suppression of free speech, and the suppression of your right to assembly. And so, like, you see how, like, I think there's a lot that we can really take from this, I feel like, because I think, in some ways, like, for folks involved in a lot of the different anti-imperialist struggle, we've seen a lot of going on around the issue of, like, censorship, folks facing censorship for their views, particularly on issues like Palestine. But even the political repression that we're seeing here in the United States is nowhere compared to around the colonized world, particularly what's going on in Kenya right now in this story. And I think, when we think of the demonstrations in Los Angeles around ICE and the stuff around what's going on in Kenya right now, I think both of these struggles, they threaten the status quo because they're targeted at a specific policy, right? They have a particular clarity of action. And I think that's something that the powers that be, that scares people.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if it's, at the end of the day, they realize that it's going to affect their everyday way of life just because it's affecting the money that goes in their pocket. And so they need to do something about it. And I think, like, the fact also that folks out there are drawing these connections to struggles that are happening here is also really important. I mean, it's like I think about, like, that's something that we see a lot. If you watch, like, international news or, like, documentaries or such, I always think about, like, the wall that they have around, I believe it's the wall that they have around either Gaza or the West Bank, just like a mural of, like, George Floyd. Like, people are aware of stuff that's happening in our country, and yet, like, at the same time, there's so many people here who don't have a clue about, like, what's happening in other places in the world, and I think it's important that folks, like, be educated and, like, try to educate themselves about this stuff. And it's difficult that we don't really see a whole lot of, like, progressive news outlets that are really trying to get into the nitty gritty about this stuff. Like, I know, like, Red Stream a couple years ago got censored on, like, Instagram. Africa Stream recently got taken down. That's messed up, because these are really important outlets that are really trying to talk about international people struggles that are happening, and these social media platforms that people are on all day, that people are sharing all this stuff about what's going on in Palestine, what's going on in Congo and Sudan. Like, they're just cutting that stuff off, And so that's why there's a need for us to dig even deeper, and us to make even more of the stuff out there, because it's like, hey, if they shut down one publication, if they shut down one more website, if we end up making half a dozen more in the process, that's a positive development in light of some not so great things happening, But yeah.
All right. That's a very interesting story. And folks can link any articles we share in the description, or they can click on any links that we share in the description for some more information.